Hey guys, welcome to this analysis of my chosen Olympic movement, which is going to be the power clean. So when teaching this Olympic movement, I think it's best to start from the ground up. So first of all, I would have my athlete find a comfortable position with their feet about shoulder width apart, and then from there we would slightly externally rotate the feet. And then in terms of bar placement relative to the body, I like to cue my athletes to use the first lace of their shoe. So when they're standing straight up before they enter the starting position here, when they look straight down, the bar should cross directly over that first lace of their shoe. This is just going to make sure that we have the correct shin angle in the starting position. So you can see here my ankles are slightly dorsiflexed, and this adds tension to the quadriceps, which, as we know, in a slightly lengthened position, muscles are able to produce the most amount of force. So from here, we move up to the knees. And like I said before, with the feet slightly externally rotated, we want to make sure that our athlete's knees are following the path of the toes. This just ensures that we are not placing any heavy tension while the knees are in a varus or valgus position, as that will be a high risk of injury to the ligaments in the knee. And the reasoning for the external rotation of the femur is it just allows for proper activation and utilization of the glute medius that you might otherwise miss out on if the feet or knees were facing directly forward. And as you can see here, a knee flexion angle of around 90 degrees with a preference of slightly more rather than slightly less is just going to help us add tension to our athletes' glutes, to their proximal hamstrings, to their quads, to ensure the maximal force application. Now, of course, there's going to be nuance in the quote-unquote perfect starting position of the power clean. A lot of times with taller athletes or athletes with longer femurs, it's harder to create this spine angle as well as this level of dorsiflexion. But as long as, while in the starting position, we can add tension to the glutes, add tension to the proximal hamstrings and to the quads, we will still be able to create as much force as possible. Now moving up, we are now at the spine, so we want to make sure that we're adding tension to the athlete's spinal erectors as well as retracting the scapula. And a good cue here for athletes to keep a big chest is to imagine they are trying to point their chest at whatever wall may be in front of them, as well as cueing them to try to pronate their hands or externally rotate their humerus. These cues, again, just ensure our athletes have the proper amount of tension throughout the musculature of the kinetic chain in order to efficiently and safely transfer energy throughout it. Now, starting the pull, we want to, or need to rather, see that the hips and knees of our athletes are extending simultaneously. And from my experience, a great way to teach the simultaneous extension of the knees and hips is to first have our athletes practice jumping with just their body weight and landing in the same position. From there, once that becomes comfortable, we can add tension like a trap bar or bands and practice this over and over until it becomes second nature. If there's any deviation in the landing, whether the athlete jumps forward or jumps backward, we know that either the hips are extending first, which would mean they would jump forward, or the knees are extending first, meaning they would jump backwards. So first, having our athletes jump unweighted is a great way to assess dominance in either the quads or the knee extensors or the glutes in the hip extensors. Moving on now with the pull, if I freeze the frame right here, you can see that my knees are almost fully extended. This is the body's way of clearing a path for the bar to move directly vertical. Now with that being said, this almost looks like an RDL, so it's going to be placing a lot of tension on our athlete's proximal hamstrings. As I mentioned before, there are always going to be nuances. Again, with our athletes that have relatively longer femurs, this spine angle here is going to be even less. It's going to look even more like a straight-legged deadlift. Again, because they have the longer femurs, they have to get their knees out of the way of the bar in order to move it directly vertical. Then, as the bar passes the knees, there will be a second knee flexion action where the athlete will scoop under the bar in order to continue the extension of the hips and knees in a vertical manner. And now, as the bar moves to the mid-thigh to hip area, what I like to see is the athletes perform one more bout of violent hip and knee extension, along with scapular elevation through the activation of the upper traps. A good cue there is shoulders to ears, as well as finishing off the triple extension with plantar flexion of the gastroc and the soleus. From here, it looks as though the bar is rising solely as a product of those previous vertical forces, but I still want the athletes to be adding to that equation by flexing both the biceps and the front delts, which looks almost like a front raise. And, these obviously aren't the main forces propelling the bar upward, but it could be the difference between a 200-pound power clean and a 210-pound power clean. And now is the point of the lift where the catch is initiated. So once our athletes are in this position of full hip, knee, and spinal extension, as well as ankle plantar flexion, I like to cue my athletes to bring their feet off the ground through rapid hip flexion. Now this is important because active hip flexion is much faster than passive. So a good cue here is I want our athletes to hear an audible stomp as their feet leave the ground and then hit the ground again. Now, of course, while this rapid hip flexion is happening at the end of triple extension, there is the rotation of the elbows or turnover of the elbows under the bar. What I like to have my athletes practice as part of their warm-up is they will perform a high pull and then as quickly as possible rotate the elbows under the bar as well as snap the hips with rapid hip flexion. With all of these cues and technique pointers, this should set the athlete up perfectly to perform the catch. And this lift, of course, being the power clean, means that we want our athletes to perform the catch with greater than 90 degrees of knee flexion. So if the athletes are not able to perform the catch under those parameters, then we are not getting the speed of the bar that we want. And so we can use the power clean and its derivatives like box cleans or hang cleans to accomplish a variety of different outcomes in terms of the force velocity curve. But of course, the main goal is to move as much weight as possible, as fast as possible. Now, with that being said, the numbers for peak power usually fall between 30 to 80% of the athlete's 1 rep max, with the lower to middle part of that spectrum being great for off-season, even glycolytic or aerobic work with lower rest times, and for in-season where we need to manage the fatigue, especially of the tendons and ligaments of the body. And so when we up the intensity to around 80 to 90%, we can use rep schemes with less volume to really push the limits of our athletes' strength speed. Now, strength speed is incredibly important when it comes to vertical force output because vertical jump height is determined by the speed of the body at takeoff. So if our athletes can move more weight more quickly, they can then accelerate their body at speeds even greater than that. And so to wrap up this analysis, I'm going to give you guys what I believe are the 3 biggest benefits of programming power cleans in the weight room. The first of which is vertical force development. So the motor patterns of triple extension are going to tremendously benefit the athletes in terms of the efficiency of jumping and of course the landing mechanics, which are going to decrease the risk of injury. The second of which being the rate of force development. Because the power clean is a highly complex and technical motor skill, the CNS activation is going to be extremely high, which will lead to a more effective and efficient recruitment of high threshold motor units, therefore increasing the ability to produce high levels of force in short amounts of time, which transitions seamlessly into jumping, sprinting, and change of direction activities that are common among all sports. The third of which is the complex lift aspect. So the upper body and the lower body are doing different things. Of course, that means there's triple extension in the lower body, as well as flexion of the arms, which I believe translates incredibly well to sports like basketball and volleyball. Basketball, of course, they are jumping while flexing the shoulder, so this is going to lead to a quicker shot, which can be the difference between a game-changing play versus not. And then in volleyball, again, jumping while flexing that shoulder can lead to more efficient setting and spiking. Now, the brain has the ability to call on past memories of how to efficiently move the body during complex tasks. So a lift like the power clean in terms of setting a base for movements like shooting and attacking, the pushing of those limits by increasing the intensity of these lifts, I believe, is the perfect transition between weight room to court.